Okay, so those are just some of the issues that people are talking about on this Freedom Day, and a lot of people pointing to various issues to say this is why we're not free, or we can't talk about celebrating Freedom Day. We speak now to Dr. Tracy Ledger, who is a senior researcher at Public Affairs Research Institute on Food Insecurity and the Plight of the Poor 27 years into democracy. So she wrote The Empty Plate in 2016. An Empty Plate analyzes the state of the South African agri-food system. So a very good evening to you, and thank you so much for speaking to us. So let's talk about why is it that we're still talking about food and hunger at this point?
Good evening. I think it's a really good question, and I think the sort of most simple answer is that it's never been directly prioritized. Reducing food insecurity, improving nutrition has never been a direct priority of the state. We always think about hunger and food insecurity as something that is the result of unemployment, and it is, because people can't afford to buy the amount of food that they have. But we've had a very, very poor response by the state to food insecurity, particularly child malnutrition. More than 1 in 4 children in South Africa is so chronically malnourished that they are stunted. And the official responses, the official policy responses have been deeply, deeply inadequate. It's never really been a priority. And I think until the coronavirus lockdown, when people were deprived of their livelihoods and they couldn't access food, that's really the first time that the full scale of the problem actually became apparent. And we were hearing policymakers and people in government saying, I had no idea things were so bad, but they've been this bad for a long time.
We'll talk about the distribution systems in just a moment, but also just to help us understand, why is it that food prices are so high? Millions of South African families go hungry while the prices paid to farmers for the same food are so low that many cannot stay in business.
I think that there are 2 parts to the issue. The one is that we can never really look at food prices in isolation. We have to look at them in terms of the ability of households to afford that food. And clearly the food that's available in the system is out of the reach for the vast majority of South African households. The analysis I've done, and that supports work that's been done by researchers before, shows that about 80% of South African households can't afford to buy a nutritionally balanced basket of food. So people might not necessarily have physical hunger, but certainly there's a huge malnutrition problem, which has huge implications across social society and the economy. So the first thing is that food is unaffordable. The other thing is that if you look at the price of food relative to the price that farmers get for the food, that gap between the two has increased steadily over the last 20 or 30 years. So the Farmgate share of the retail price of food has declined steadily. And you see that in a basic food item, like I always like to use milk as an example. So the price that farmers get is only around 5 Rand a litre if they're lucky. But the price that we pay in the supermarkets is considerably higher, sometimes 3 or even 4 times that price. And that gap has been widening. So we have a situation where dairy products are generally underconsumed. It's one of the most underconsumed products for young children. It's related to their lack of quality protein in their diet. But in order to give a child the minimum requirement of fresh milk every day, would cost more than half of the childcare grant every month. So I think it's a question of the differences between the Farmgate price of food and the retail price of food, but also that food is completely unaffordable for the basic household. And that's what happens when you commodify a necessity of life. You know, food is not like shoes or TV sets. If you don't eat, you die.
So I want you to talk about the producers of the food and how they then fall into what you call a just transition narrative.
The producers of food.
Yes, so the farm workers, for instance, why they remain amongst the most insecure, and how does that relate to a just, narrative, or a narrative of a just transition?
Well, I think that the thing is, farm workers are a particular case because they're more or less invisible in the system. And farm workers are among the worst paid, the most abused, and the most food insecure grouping in South Africa. So it's this awful irony that the people who produce our food are least likely to be able to afford to feed their own families. And that's really got a lot to do with the way in which value is allocated in the value chain. So who gets the value from retail food? Well, it's the large retailers and the large agro-processing companies and the biggest farmers, because you need significant economies of scale in order to be able to survive in this kind of industrialized food system. This is why it's so incredibly difficult for small-scale farmers to stay in business in the system, because the margins are so small. And of course, the farm workers lose out left, right, and center. No one seems to be too concerned about them. But I think it's also important, a lot of people, I've been listening to what people have been saying in your Twitter line, and people have been talking about land. And yes, there are many reasons why people want access to land. And certainly many of those reasons have got nothing to do with economics or agriculture. But some of those reasons have got to do with having access to land in order to be able to earn a living from agriculture. And the problem is that it's almost impossible for a new or emerging farmer or a small farmer to actually earn a living in this kind of agricultural system. So we need to understand all the multiple ways in which this industrialized food system undermines the ability of people to earn a living from the land as well.
Including our energy systems, take us through why that is part of the causal linkages that, further entrench poverty and inequality.
Sorry, I didn't get that. Which system?
The energy systems.
Well, I mean, the thing is that that's also linked to food, in that people need access to affordable energy in order to be able to store food, in order to be able to cook food. And if they can't afford to pay their electricity bill, which it appears that more and more poor households in South Africa are unable to do, then, they resort either to burning coal. Indoor air pollution in South Africa is a very serious problem. We always think about air pollution as something that's outside, but actually indoor air pollution is a very serious problem in South Africa. The research indicates that as many as 1,400 children a year in South Africa die as a result of indoor air pollution. So, and the other thing is people are also making choices about what to cook based on the cost of energy. People will say, I know that cooking beans, for example, is a more nutritious food than quick cooking pop, but you need a lot more paraffin to cook the beans, and I can't afford the paraffin. So there's definitely a link between households' ability to access affordable and clean and safe energy and the choices that they make around food.
I wish we had more time to speak to you, but thank you so much for sharing those insights. Dr. Tracy Ledger, who is a senior researcher at Public Affairs Research Institute.